The fire crackled low against the New Mexico night, casting dancing shadows across the weathered face of Cole Brennan as he stared into the flames. October air carried the scent of creosote and sage across the empty desert, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to the rising moon. Beside him, 14-year-old Tommy Ward shifted closer to the warmth, his young face bright with curiosity. The boy had been unusually quiet during their 3-day ride back from Santa Fe, but Cole knew that silence. He had worn it himself once, back when questions burned hotter than any campfire and the world seemed full of mysteries that only grown men understood. Tommy reached up to touch the scar on Cole's shoulder, the one that showed through the tear in his shirt. His fingers traced the old wound with the gentle reverence of someone too young to fully understand the cost of survival. "When did you get this one?" Tommy asked. Cole continued staring at the flames, watching them twist and bend like memories trying to escape the past. 5 full seconds passed before he spoke, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of those 3 years like stones in a river. 3 years back. The boy waited, knowing better than to rush a story from a man like Cole. In the years since his father died, Tommy had learned that Cole Brennan measured his words the way a prospector measured gold. Carefully, precisely, never wasting a single grain. "Were you ever scared?" The question hung in the desert air between them. Cole picked up a stick and prodded the fire, sending sparks spiraling up toward the stars. Another long pause followed, the kind that made younger men uncomfortable, but which Tommy had learned to respect. When Cole finally met the boy's eyes, there was something in his gaze that looked like true stripped bare. Every single day for 3 months straight, Tommy leaned forward, his shadow growing long across the sand. Cole set down the stick and pulled his coat tighter against the October chill. In the firelight, his face looked older than his 31 years, carved by sun and wind and choices that left marks deeper than any blade. "Summer of 1882, Cole began, his voice settling into the rhythm of storytelling. "I had to make a choice, marry a woman I had never met, or let you become an orphan for the second time." The boy's eyes widened. In all their time together, Cole had never spoken of how they came to Red Ridge, how their lives had twisted together like rope under tension. Tommy knew his own father had died, knew Cole had taken him in, but the details remained as mysterious as the desert itself. "What did you choose?" Cole allowed himself the ghost of a smile, barely visible in the flickering light. He gestured toward Tommy with one calloused hand, the kind of hand that had held both rifles and reins for more years than the boy had been alive. "You are sitting here, are you not?" The fire popped and settled. Cole reached into his saddlebag and pulled out his Winchester Model 1873, the rifle that had traveled with him since the war ended. His hands moved with practiced ease as he checked the mechanism. 15 rounds ready to fire from a 24-inch barrel that had saved his life more times than he could count. The weapon gleamed dully in the firelight, more companion than tool. He set the rifle across his knees and looked out into the darkness beyond their small circle of warmth. Somewhere out there, miles away across the desert floor, lay the ranch he and Sierra had built from blood and determination. Somewhere beyond that lay the graves of men who had made different choices, paid different prices. "Before I tell you this story," Cole said quietly, "you need to understand something. The world is not simple. Good men do bad things when they are afraid. Bad men sometimes find their way back when they have reason enough. And sometimes the line between the two is so thin you cannot see it until you are standing right on top of it." Tommy nodded solemnly, though Cole suspected the boy did not yet understand. He would, though. Life had a way of teaching those lessons, whether a man wanted to learn them or not. 3 years back," Cole continued, "you were 11 years old. I was 28. We rode into a town called Red Ridge on the hottest June day I can remember, looking for work in the silver mines nearby." He paused, remembering the weight of that heat, the way it pressed down like a physical thing. The way Tommy had looked then, smaller and thinner, still carrying the hollow look of a child who had lost everything. "Your father, James, had been dead 1 year. He made me promise before he died that I would take care of you. Not because I owed him anything, though I did, but because that is what men do. We do not abandon the families of the men who fought beside us." The words came slowly now, each one measured and placed with care. Cole was not a man who spoke of emotion directly. He showed it through action, through the steady presence that had kept Tommy fed and safe and taught for the past 3 years. But tonight, with the fire low and the story demanding to be told, he allowed himself this small vulnerability. Red Ridge was not much of a town. 300 people, one sheriff, two saloons, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business before breakfast. Cole stood and walked to his horse, a sturdy Mustang that had carried him across half of New Mexico. From the saddlebag, he pulled out a leather canteen, took a long drink, then offered it to Tommy. The boy drank, then handed it back, his eyes never leaving Cole's face. We needed money. I needed work. You needed a place to sleep that did not involve the hard ground every night. So we found a cheap hotel room, $1 for the night, and I went to the saloon to ask about the mines. The memory came back sharp and clear, the smell of whiskey and tobacco, the sound of cards shuffling and coins clinking, the way conversations stopped when he walked in, the way eyes measured him and found him wanting or dangerous or both. In the saloon, men were talking about a man named Magnus Holloway. They said he was the most powerful man in the territory, owned the biggest ranch, controlled the water rights, had enough money to buy and sell half the town. They said he was looking for someone, but the man they sent before me had disappeared into the desert and never came back. Tommy shifted uneasily. Cole sat back down, his movements slow and deliberate. An old gunfighter, his face scarred from a knife fight years before, pulled me aside. He told me not to take any job from Magnus Holloway. When I asked why, he looked at me like I was already dead. He said the last man who worked for Holloway rode out into the desert and no one ever saw him again. The fire crackled. Cole fetted another piece of dried mesquite, watching the wood catch and burn. I asked if maybe the man just left town. The gunfighter shook his head. He said in a desert like this, leaving and disappearing are the same thing. A long silence followed. Cole let it stretch, let Tommy feel the weight of those words. Finally, the boy spoke. But you took the job anyway. I did not have a choice, Cole said simply. Not really. We were down to our last $20. The mines were not hiring, and I had you to think about. He paused again, remembering that moment of decision, the way fear and necessity had wrestled inside him until necessity won by simple exhaustion. Before I could decide anything, 6 of Magnus Holloway's men surrounded me outside the saloon. They were not gentle about it. They told me their boss wanted to see me. They told me to come quiet or not come at all. So I went. Cole stood and walked to the edge of their firelight, looking out into the vast darkness of the desert. The stars overhead burned with cold intensity, the same stars that had watched everything unfold 3 years ago. They took me to the Holloway Ranch. It was built like a fortress. Thick adobe walls, 2 feet deep, iron bars on every window. The kind of place a man builds when he knows enemies are coming and wants to be ready. He turned back to Tommy, his face half in shadow. Magnus Holloway was waiting in his study. He was 55 years old then, but he looked older. Tall man, over 6 feet with gray hair and a scar that ran from his forehead down to his cheek. The kind of scar a man gets from a knife, not from an accident. Cole sat back down, his movements slow and tired. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He looked at me like he was measuring livestock and said, I hear you were a scout in the war. I told him yes. He asked if I was any good. I told him I was still alive. He nodded like that was the only answer that mattered. The fire burned lower. Cole fed it again, his hands steady despite the memories churning through him. Then he told me his daughter needed a husband. Just like that. No explanation, no introduction. My daughter needs a husband. I told him I did not need a wife. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He said maybe I did not need a wife, but I did need land, money, and a future for the boy I was raising. Tommy made a small sound, halfway between surprise and understanding. Cole nodded. He knew about you. Knew everything about me, actually. Where I had served, who I fought with, how your father died. Magnus Holloway was the kind of man who learned everything about a person before he made them an offer. Cole pulled out a small gold coin from his pocket, a $20 gold eagle he had carried since the war ended. He turned it over in his fingers, letting the firelight catch the worn edges. He offered me 5,000 acres of land, a silver mine, property worth $200,000. All I had to do was marry his daughter, protect her, and help secure her inheritance. What was wrong with her? Tommy asked quietly. That is the question I asked. Magnus told me she was ugly, said she had been raised partly by the Apache, that she was too wild, too difficult, too unmarriageable by normal standards. He said only a man who needed the land badly enough would agree, a man who could look past appearances and understand the value of the opportunity. Trummer and Cole looked at Tommy steadily. I asked what happened if I refused. Magnus did not answer with words. He just looked out the window toward where you were playing with one of the ranch dogs in the courtyard. Then he looked back at me. The message was clear. The boy swallowed hard. Cole continued, his voice level and measured. I told him I wanted to meet his daughter first. He agreed too quickly, which told me everything I needed to know. This was not a negotiation. This was a trap disguised as an opportunity. Cole stood again and walked to his saddle, running his hand along the worn McClellan cavalry saddle he still used. 8 pounds of government issue that had carried him through the war and every year since. Some men changed with the times. Cole kept what worked. Magnus showed me documents, legal papers about land ownership. He explained something called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo from 1848. After the Mexican-American War, the treaty said that people of Mexican and native descent could own land if they proved their claim. His daughter Sierra could prove her claim through her mother, who was Apache. The explanation came slowly, carefully, as Cole worked through the legal complications that had seemed overwhelming 3 years ago. But there was a catch. New Mexico Territory law from 1850 said that unmarried women could not own more than 640 acres. If Sierra married, her husband would become the legal manager of her property. Magnus needed someone to marry her to secure the full inheritance, someone he could control. Tommy was quiet, processing this information. Cole sat back down, his joints cracking slightly as he settled. I asked Magnus what he got out of this arrangement. He told me he owed $50,000 to the bank. The debt had grown from $10,000 he borrowed back in 1878. 20% interest per year for 7 years. He needed Sierra's land to pay it back. If I married her, became the legal owner, he could persuade me to help him. But you did not agree right away. No, I told him I needed to see her first, meet her, hear her side of things. Magnus agreed, but he made one condition. You would stay at his ranch while I traveled to the Apache camp. Insurance that I would come back. Cole's jaw tightened at the memory, the moment when he had to choose between his own safety and Tommy's, knowing that either choice could end badly. I knelt down to your eye level that morning, asked you what you would do if I did not come back in 3 days. You told me you would ride to Santa Fe and find Sheriff Morgan, just like we practiced. I told you not to trust anyone at the ranch. You asked if I would come back. I did not answer right away. I looked at you for 5 long seconds, weighing the promise against the danger. Then I told you yes. I promised I would come back. The memory still carried weight. Cole could see it clearly. Tommy standing in the courtyard, trying so hard to be brave, to be the man his father had wanted him to become. Magnus, 8 of his gunmen, and I rode out the next morning, 40 miles through the Chihuahuan Desert. 2 days of riding through heat that reached 105 degrees. We carried 2 gallons of water per person per day and rationed every drop. Cole demonstrated with his hands, showing the size of the leather canteens they had used. The desert out there is not like anything you have seen before. Saguaro cacti taller than houses, mountains that look close but take days to reach, heat that makes the air shimmer and turns men stupid if they do not respect it. He paused, remembering the journey with perfect clarity. I watched Magnus's men during that ride. They were afraid of him. Not loyal, just afraid. There is a difference. Loyalty means a man will follow you into danger. Fear means he will follow you because the danger of refusing is worse. Tommy nodded, understanding that distinction in a way that made Cole proud. On the second night, we made camp near a dry creek bed. The men built a fire and drank whiskey. One of them, a young gunfighter named Billy, maybe 19 years old, got drunk enough to talk. He pulled me aside and told me I should not have agreed to come. I asked him why. Cole's voice dropped lower, more intense. Billy told me that Magnus's daughter had killed two men who refused to marry her, that she was dangerous, violent, unpredictable. I asked him if he saw this happen. He admitted he had not. It was just what people said. I told him that rumors are not the same as truth. He looked at me like I was a fool, but he did not say anything else. The fire was burning low again. Cole let it, letting the darkness creep closer as his story moved toward its turning point. The next afternoon, we reached the Mescalero Apache camp near the Sacramento Mountains. About 40 wickiups, traditional shelters made from bent willow branches covered with animal hide or dried grass. Maybe 150 people lived there. It was a permanent camp, not temporary. These people had been there for generations. Cole's voice took on a tone of respect, the kind earned through experience rather than assumption. The Apache chief came out to meet us. His name was Dakota. He was 65 years old, long white hair, scars across his chest from old battles. He did not speak English to Magnus, which was deliberate. It was his way of showing disrespect. But he spoke English to me. Cole remembered that moment perfectly. The way Dakota had looked at him with eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone straight into a man's intentions. Dakota said Magnus told him I was a good man. I said Magnus did not know me. Dakota asked me if I had ever killed to protect someone. I nodded. He said then I understood the value of a life, and that was all that mattered. The old chief's words had carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Cole had felt tested in that moment, measured against standards he did not fully understand. Dakota took me to his private lodge. He poured tea made from creosote plant, traditional Apache medicine. We sat in silence for 10 full seconds, just drinking and looking at each other. No words, just evaluation. Then he began to talk. Cole shifted his position, settling in for the crucial part of the story. He told me that Sierra was his niece, the daughter of his sister, Ayana, who had married Magnus Holloway 26 years before. When Ayana died 12 years ago, Magnus sent Sierra to live with the Apache. She was 13 years old. Magnus promised to come back for her in 6 months, after things settled down. The bitterness in those words still echoed. Cole let it hang there. I asked how long ago that was. Dakota said 12 years. Magnus never came back, never sent a letter, never explained. Sierra grew up believing her father had abandoned her. She learned Apache ways, became one of the people. Then a few months ago, Magnus suddenly returned and demanded she come back. He said it was time for her to marry and secure her inheritance. Tommy was leaning forward now, completely absorbed. Cole continued, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying the words. I asked Dakota why Magnus really wanted Sierra back. The old chief smiled, but there was no humor in it. He told me the land Sierra inherited was worth far more than $200,000. There was a silver mine that had never been fully explored. Early surveys suggested it could be worth $500,000, maybe more. The firelight caught Cole's eyes, making them glitter with something that might have been anger or might have been resignation. Magnus had lied about the value. He needed Sierra's land to pay his debts, but he also saw an opportunity to become truly wealthy. If Sierra married someone he could control, Magnus could manage the mine and keep most of the profits. Sierra would have legal ownership, but no real power. Cole stood and paced to the edge of the firelight again. Dakota told me something else. There was another man involved, Samuel Garrett, who owned the bank in Red Ridge. But Garrett was not just a banker. Before he bought the bank, he had been a notorious land grabber. He would loan money at impossible rates, then use forged court documents to seize property when people could not pay. Garrett had stolen land from 15 families in 5 years. Now he wanted Sierra's land. The pieces of the story were falling into place now, each one adding weight to what came next. Dakota asked me why he should tell me all this. I was just a stranger hired by Magnus. Why should he trust me? I told him the truth. I said I did not know if he should trust me. But I did know that I asked questions, which was more than the other men had done. That seemed to be enough. Cole sat back down, his movement slower now, tireder. Dakota gave me one warning before I left his lodge. He said if I truly wanted to help Sierra, I should meet her alone that night, away from Magnus, away from the camp, somewhere we could speak honestly. The fire crackled. Cole fed it one more time, building it back up as his story approached its climax. I waited until after dark. The camp was settling down for the night. I walked toward the small stream that ran past the edge of the settlement, following the sound of water over stones, and that is where I found her. Cole paused, letting the moment breathe. Sierra Holloway was kneeling by the stream, washing her face. She had taken off the ceremonial bandana that Apache women wore, the one that had covered her face during my arrival. Her back was to me, but I could see her reflection in the water, lit by moonlight. His voice took on a different quality now, something almost reverent. Magnus had called her ugly, but the woman I saw was not ugly at all. She had high cheekbones, the strong features of her Apache heritage, dark eyes that seemed to hold storms, long black hair that fell past her waist, skin darkened by years under the desert sun, a small scar on her chin from some old hunting accident. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness or conventional standards. She was beautiful the way a hawk is beautiful, wild and strong and completely herself. Tommy was staring at Cole with new understanding. Cole met his eyes. She knew I was there, did not even turn around, just spoke to the water, her voice clear and measured. She asked if I thought she was ugly. I said no. She asked why her father said she was. I told her it was to keep men from coming for her beauty. Only someone desperate enough for land would accept Magnus's offer. Cole smiled slightly at the memory. She was quiet for 5 seconds, then she turned to look at me. She said I was smarter than she expected. I told her I had learned to pay attention to what men do not say as much as what they do say. The conversation that followed had changed everything. Cole chose his words carefully now, making sure Tommy understood not just what was said, but what it meant. Sierra asked what I wanted. I told her I had not decided yet. She seemed surprised by that. She said I was the first man who did not already have his answer ready. I asked her what she wanted. She looked at me for a long time, maybe 8 full seconds, just studying my face in the moonlight. Then she told me the truth. Cole leaned forward, his voice dropping. She said her father was not just in debt. He owed money to a killer. Samuel Garrett was not just a banker. He was a murderer who had learned to use law instead of guns. 2 men before me had refused to marry Sierra. Both disappeared in the desert. Their bodies were never found. The words hung heavy in the night air. Tommy shivered despite the fire's warmth. Sierra told me that if I married her, Garrett would kill me eventually. If I refused, Magnus could not let me leave knowing too much. Either way I was likely to die. She was giving me that information not to scare me, but to be honest. She was tired of lies. Cole stood one final time, his silhouette dark against the stars. I asked her if she wanted to marry me. She laughed, but it was not a happy sound. She said she did not want to marry anyone. She wanted to be free, free from her father's manipulation, free from Garrett's threats, free to live on her own terms. But freedom seemed impossible. He turned back to Tommy. I told her I would think about it, that I needed to understand everything before I made my choice. She nodded and said I had until morning. Then she walked back toward the camp, leaving me alone by the stream. The fire was burning steady now. Cole sat back down for the last part. The next morning, Dakota called everyone together for the ceremony. He made it clear that Sierra had to agree publicly and willingly, or there would be no marriage. Magnus was furious, but could not argue. The Apache warriors would not allow it. Cole's voice took on a formal quality, remembering the weight of that moment. Sierra stood before the tribe. She spoke first in Apache, then in English. She said she chose me not because her father demanded it, not because law required it. She chose me because I had asked her what she wanted. She said the marriage would be legal on paper, but her heart remained her own. If I wanted her heart, I would have to prove worthy of it. Tommy was transfixed. Cole continued. I had learned some Apache words from Dakota the night before. I spoke them poorly, with a terrible accent, but I spoke them. I said I respected her freedom. I would not demand her heart. I promised only that no one would force her to do anything she did not want to do, including me. The memory of that vow still carried power. Cole felt it even now, 3 years later. There was silence after I spoke. Dakota placed his hands on both our heads. For 15 seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. Just the sound of wind across the desert and the soft beating of Apache drums. Cole paused, then his voice hardened. That is when 3 of Garrett's men burst into the camp. The shift in tone was deliberate and sharp. Tommy jerked slightly, pulled from the solemn moment into sudden violence. They did not shoot. They wanted Sierra alive. Garrett needed her to sign documents transferring her land. Dead, she was useless to him. So they tried to grab her, to drag her away during the confusion. Cole's hands tightened into fists at the memory. The first man lunged at Sierra. I hit him hard enough to break his nose, and he went down. The second man pulled a gun. An Apache warrior put an arrow through his shoulder before he could fire. The third man managed to grab Sierra from behind, one arm around her throat. Even 3 years later, Cole could feel the spike of fear that had shot through him in that moment. But Sierra did not need me to save her. She used an Apache fighting technique, stomping down on the man's instep, driving her elbow back into his face, then flipping him over her hip. He hit the ground hard. I ran forward, kicked his gun away, and put him in a chokehold until he stopped fighting. Pride crept into Cole's voice despite himself. The Apache warriors surrounded the other 2. We had prisoners. Magnus stood there with his mouth open, shocked by how fast everything had happened. Then he did something unexpected. Cole let the pause stretch. A 4th gunman tried to run. Magnus pulled his weapon and shot the man in the leg. It was not a killing shot, but it stopped him. That was the first time in 12 years that Magnus Holloway had protected anyone other than himself. The significance of that action hung in the air. Tommy understood it instinctively. We questioned the man Magnus shot. Dakota asked who sent him. The man was bleeding badly, in pain, and he talked. He said Garrett had paid them $1,000 to kidnap Sierra. They were supposed to bring her to Garrett alive so he could force her to sign papers. After that, Garrett would kill her and claim the land through legal manipulation. Cole's voice went cold. I asked what Magnus knew about this plan. The wounded man looked at Magnus and laughed through his pain. He said Magnus had agreed to it, that Magnus would get his debts cleared if he let Garrett take Sierra's land. The man died still laughing. The accusation hung between them like smoke. Sierra turned to look at her father, asked him if it was true. Magnus could not speak, could not deny it, could not explain. He just stood there silent, and his silence was all the answer Sierra needed. Cole stood and walked to where his Winchester leaned against a rock. He picked it up, checked it one more time, then set it down gently. That is where the first part of the story ends. That is how I came to be married to Sierra Holloway. Not for love, not even for land, really, but because the alternative was letting an innocent woman die and leaving you an orphan. Tommy was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. Did you love her? Eventually? Cole looked at the boy, then up at the stars, then back to the dying fire. That is a story for another night. Right now, you need to understand something important. In 3 days, we are going to visit Sierra's father's grave. You have never been there, and you should see it. Magnus Holloway was not a good man for most of his life, but at the end, he became something different. At the end, he found a way to be the father Sierra deserved. He sat down one last time, his voice carrying the weight of experience. The world is not simple, Tommy. Good men make terrible choices when they are afraid. Bad men sometimes find redemption when they have reason enough. Magnus Holloway was both. He abandoned his daughter, he made deals with killers, he lulled and manipulated and nearly got us all killed. But in the end, when it mattered most, he chose differently. He chose to be brave, and that choice cost him everything. The fire crackled low, stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. Somewhere in the darkness, the coyote called again, its voice lonely and wild. Tomorrow night I will tell you about the battle, about how we fought Garrett's men, about how Sierra proved she was stronger than anyone imagined, about how Magnus Holloway died and what he said at the end. But tonight you need to sleep. We have a long ride ahead of us. Tommy nodded slowly, then crawled into his bedroll. Cole stayed by the fire, watching the flames die down to embers, remembering everything that had come after that moment in the Apache camp. The alliances formed, the plans made, the desperate gamble that had nearly cost them all their lives. But for now, the story could wait. For now, it was enough to sit under the stars and remember that every choice carried weight. Every decision had consequences. And sometimes the difference between hero and villain came down to a single moment when a man decided to be brave instead of safe. Cole pulled his coat tighter and stared into the darkness, where 3 years ago and 3 days from now existed in the same eternal desert night. The second night found them camped in a shallow arroyo, sheltered from the wind that swept across the high desert like the breath of something ancient and indifferent. Tommy had asked no questions during the day's ride, but Cole could feel the weight of unspoken curiosity pressing against the boy's silence like water against a dam. They ate beans and hardtack in the fading light, and when the fire was built and the horses tended, Tommy finally broke. What happened after the gunmen attacked? Cole poured coffee from the battered pot, the steam rising in thin wisps that disappeared into the cooling air. He handed Tommy a cup and settled back against his saddle, arranging his thoughts like a man loading bullets into a cylinder. Each one had to fit precisely, or the whole mechanism would fail. After the man died, there was silence, the kind that comes when everyone realizes the stakes just got higher than anyone expected. Sierra stood there looking at her father like she was seeing him for the first time, or maybe seeing him clearly for the first time in 12 years. Cole sipped his coffee, letting the bitter heat center him in the memory. Dakota ordered his warriors to take the dead and wounded away. The Apache have specific rituals for death, even the death of enemies. They believe every soul needs proper ceremony or it lingers, causing trouble for the living. So they carried the bodies to the edge of camp and began preparations. The fire crackled and popped. Cole fed it another piece of mesquite, watching the wood catch and burn with that same patient intensity he brought to everything. Magnus tried to speak, opened his mouth like he had words ready, but Sierra cut him off. She said his name once, just once, Magnus. That was all. But the way she said it carried 12 years of abandonment, 12 years of wondering why she was not enough to make her father come back. He closed his mouth and said nothing. Tommy shifted closer to the fire. The temperature was dropping fast the way it does in high desert country, where the thin air holds no heat once the sun disappears. I told Dakota we needed to talk. Private. Just Sierra, Magnus, and me. The old chief nodded and led us to his personal lodge, then stood outside as a guard. Inside, the space was small and dim, lit only by a single oil lamp that cast long shadows up the curved walls. Cole paused, remembering the weight of that moment. Sierra spoke first, asked Magnus directly if he had made a deal with Garrett, asked if he had agreed to let Garrett take her land in exchange for clearing his debts. Magnus stood there for 7 full seconds without answering. You could hear each second tick by in the silence. Then Sierra shouted at him, demanded an answer. Her voice was not sad. It was furious, pure rage that her own father would sell her like livestock. The memory still carried an electrical charge. Cole could feel it even now, 3 years removed. Magnus finally spoke. He said yes, just that one word, yes. He had made a deal with Garrett. Sierra started crying, but these were not soft tears. These were the tears of someone who has been betrayed so deeply that the body does not know any other way to respond. Cole set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his face intense in the firelight. Then Magnus told us the truth, the whole truth, not in small pieces or careful evasions, but in one long confession that poured out of him like poison from a wound. He settled back, his voice dropping into the cadence of recitation. Magnus said that 12 years ago, when his wife Ayana died, something inside him broke. He started drinking, started gambling, made bad investments trying to recoup losses from previous bad investments. By 1878, he was drowning in debt and desperate. That was when he met Samuel Garrett. The name hung in the air like smoke. Garrett had just bought the bank in Red Ridge. He seemed legitimate, professional, friendly even. He offered Magnus $10,000 at what seemed like reasonable terms, 20% interest, but Magnus was confident he could pay it back within a year. So he took the money. Cole picked up a stick and prodded the fire, sending sparks spiraling up toward the stars. But Magnus did not pay it back in a year. The interest compounded. 20% per year does not sound like much until you do the mathematics. After 7 years, that 10,000 had grown to 50,000. Magnus could not pay, did not have the assets. Everything he owned was mortgaged or worthless. Tommy was listening with the focused intensity of someone learning a hard lesson about the world. Garrett came to Magnus last year with a proposition. He said the solution was simple. Sierra owned 5,000 acres with a silver mine. If Magnus could get someone to marry her, the husband would legally control the property under territorial law. Then Garrett could pressure or bribe or threaten that husband into signing over the mineral rights. After that, Garrett would arrange an accident. The husband would die. Sierra would be a widow with no claim to anything. Garrett would own the mine. Magnus's debts would be cleared, and everyone would be satisfied. The casual cruelty of it made Tommy's face go pale even in the firelight. Magnus told us he agreed. He was terrified of what Garrett would do if he refused. Garrett had killed before, had made people disappear. Magnus was a coward, he said. He chose his own safety over his daughter's life. Cole let that statement sit for a moment, then continued. Sierra asked Magnus why he could not just sell his ranch, pay the debt, start over. Magnus said the ranch was already mortgaged beyond its value. He had nothing left except Sierra's land, and that land was not his to sell. So he decided to steal it using legal manipulation and a desperate stranger who needed money badly enough to marry a woman he had never met. The fire burned steady. Cole's voice remained level, without judgment, but also without sympathy. I asked Magnus if he understood that Garrett would have killed me too. After I signed whatever papers were needed, I would have become a liability. Magnus nodded, said he knew, said he had justified it by telling himself I was a drifter, that no one would miss me, that I had chosen to take the risk. But when he said it out loud, he could hear how hollow it sounded. Tommy spoke quietly. What did Sierra do? She turned her back on him, literally, stood up and walked out of the lodge without another word. Magnus reached out like he wanted to touch her, to stop her, but his hand just hung in the air between them. 10 full seconds of him standing there with his arm extended toward a daughter who was already gone. Then he dropped his hand and stood there shaking. Cole drank the last of his coffee, now cold and bitter. I stayed in the lodge with Magnus. Not because I felt sorry for him, but because I needed to understand something. I asked him why he sent Sierra away 12 years ago if he loved her, why he abandoned a 13-year-old girl to live with strangers. The question had been eating at Cole since Dakota first told him the story. Now he finally had the answer. Magnus sat down heavily, like all the strength had left his body. He told me that when Ayanna died, he could not look at Sierra, not because he did not love her, but because she looked exactly like her mother. Same eyes, same smile, same way of moving through the world. Every time Magnus saw his daughter, he saw his dead wife, and the grief was so overwhelming that he felt like he was drowning. Cole's voice softened slightly, acknowledging the complexity of human pain. He sent Sierra away not to punish her, but to save himself. He told himself it was temporary, that he would heal and bring her back. But months turned into years, and the guilt of abandoning her made it harder to face her, which made him avoid her more, which created more guilt. It was a spiral that he could not escape. Tommy nodded slowly, beginning to understand how weakness could compound itself into something monstrous. I asked Magnus why he came back now after 12 years. He said because Garrett forced him. When Magnus could not pay the debt, Garrett discovered that Sierra owned valuable land. He demanded Magnus bring her back and arrange a marriage, or Garrett would kill him. So Magnus returned not out of love, but out of fear. And that truth, more than anything else, was what destroyed any remaining relationship between father and daughter. Cole stood and walked to the edge of their firelight, looking out into the darkness where distant mesas were barely visible against the starlit sky. I went to find Sierra. She was standing alone at the edge of the Apache camp, looking out toward the desert. I asked her what she wanted to do. She said she wanted to go to Red Ridge, confront Garrett, take back her land, and never see her father again. The determination in Sierra's voice that night had been absolute. Cole had recognized it as the kind of resolve that could not be talked out of or reasoned with. I asked if she planned to go alone. She said she did not expect me to help. Our marriage was legal now. I could leave with Tommy, and no one would stop me. She released me from any obligation. Cole turned back to face Tommy across the fire. But I told her I was staying. She asked why. I said because I made a promise during the ceremony. I said no one would force her to do anything she did not want. That promise included protecting her from men who would take her land and kill her for it. Tommy's eyes shone with something like pride. Cole acknowledged it with a slight nod. Sierra looked at me for a long time, maybe 8 full seconds. Then she said we needed a plan. We could not just ride into Red Ridge and expect to win through confrontation. Garrett had money, men, and legal documents that appeared legitimate. We had truth, but truth without power is just noise. The coffee pot was empty. Cole set it aside and continued. We went back to Dakota's lodge. This time Magnus was not invited. Inside, Dakota gathered his senior warriors, and we discussed strategy. The old chief laid out what we knew about Garrett. How he had stolen land from 15 families over 5 years. How he used forged court documents and bribed judges. How he maintained a small army of hired guns disguised as ranch hands. Cole sat back down, his movements deliberate and measured. I said we had 3 objectives. First, prove the court documents were forged. Second, gather the families Garrett had wronged and convince them to stand together. Third, get word to the territorial governor in Santa Fe about the crimes. If we could accomplish all 3, we might have enough legal weight to stop Garrett without resorting to violence. Tommy leaned forward. Did it work? I'm getting there, Cole said with the ghost of a smile. Dakota agreed with the plan. He said he would send riders to Santa Fe immediately. Fast riders who knew the desert trails and could reach the capital in 5 days instead of the usual 7. He would carry documents detailing everything we knew about Garrett's crimes. The fire needed more fuel. Tommy volunteered to gather wood from their small supply, and Cole waited until the flames were built back up before continuing. The question was what to do about Magnus. Sierra did not want him involved, did not trust him, did not want to be in the same territory as him, frankly. But Dakota made an argument that I had not expected. Cole paused, remembering the old chief's wisdom. Dakota said that Magnus had made terrible choices out of fear and weakness. But those same qualities meant Magnus knew exactly how Garrett operated. Magnus had helped Garrett forge documents before. He knew where Garrett kept his records. He knew the names of the men Garrett had bribed. He could get into places we could not because Garrett still thought Magnus was on his side. The logic was sound even if the emotional reality was complicated. I proposed that we give Magnus one chance, one opportunity to prove he could choose differently. If he helped us get evidence against Garrett, he could begin to earn back Sierra's trust. If he betrayed us, Dakota's warriors would make sure he never betrayed anyone again. Tommy's eyes went wide. Cole met his gaze steadily. In the real world, trust is earned through action, not words. Magnus had spent 12 years making the wrong choices. Now he had one chance to make a right one. We would give him that chance, but we would not be foolish about it. The night air was cold now. Both of them pulled their coats tighter. Sierra did not like it. She wanted nothing to do with her father, but she was also practical enough to understand that we needed every advantage we could get. So she agreed with one condition. Magnus would not speak to her, would not try to apologize, would not try to explain or justify himself. He would do his job, help us get the evidence, and then leave her alone forever. Cole's voice carried the weight of that moment. Magnus agreed. He looked broken when he accepted the terms, but he agreed. Dakota assigned 2 warriors to watch Magnus at all times. If he tried to warn Garrett or betray us, they would kill him immediately. Magnus understood. These 2 warriors would accompany us back to Red Ridge, while the rest remained to protect the camp. The plan was set. Cole described the journey back to Red Ridge, 3 days through the desert with Magnus riding separately from the main group, the 2 Apache warriors flanking him like silent judges. We rode through country that was beautiful and harsh in equal measure, cholas and ocotillos standing like sentinels. The occasional Joshua tree twisted into shapes that seemed almost human, and everywhere the sense that the land itself was watching, waiting to see if we were strong enough to survive its indifference. The description painted itself across Cole's words, vivid and immediate despite the distance of years. On the second night, while Sierra was checking on the horses, I sat with Magnus, not because I liked him or trusted him, but because I needed to understand him. I asked what he would do if we succeeded. If we stopped Garrett and secured Sierra's land, what then? Tommy waited, barely breathing. Magnus said he did not know. He said he had spent so many years running from grief that he did not know how to do anything else. He asked me if I thought Sierra would ever forgive him. I told him the truth. I said forgiveness was not something he could demand or expect. It was something Sierra might choose to give or might not. The only thing Magnus could control was whether he became worthy of forgiveness, and that would take years of consistent action. The wisdom of that answer seemed to surprise Magnus even then. Cole had seen it in the older man's face, a kind of recognition that maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward even if it was long and painful. I told Magnus something else. I told him about your father, James, about how we fought together in the war, about how he saved my life at Shiloh by pulling me out of a burning supply wagon, about how I promised him on his deathbed that I would take care of you. Cole's voice roughened slightly at the memory. I said that keeping promises to the dead was how we honored them, how we proved that their lives mattered. Magnus had made promises, too, probably, to Ayanna, to Sierra when she was born. He had broken all of them. But breaking a promise did not mean he could never make another one. It just meant the next one had to be kept no matter the cost. The fire popped loudly, breaking the intensity of the moment. Cole took a breath and continued. Magnus asked if I thought he was a coward. I said yes. He nodded like he expected that answer. Then I told him that every brave person I ever knew had been a coward at some point first. Bravery was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite fear. Magnus could choose to be brave now, even if he had been a coward for 12 years. That choice was always available. Tommy's face showed that he was processing this, understanding that human nature was more complex than simple categories of good and evil. We reached Red Ridge on the afternoon of the third day. The town looked the same as when I left it, but everything felt different. Now I knew what was underneath the surface. The corruption, the fear, the families living under Garrett's shadow. Cole described how they set up in Magnus's ranch, how Tommy came running out when he saw them approach. The boy had been terrified but had hidden it well, being brave the way children are brave when they have no choice. You asked me about Sierra, Cole said to Tommy. Asked if she was my wife. I said it was complicated. Then Sierra knelt down to your level and introduced herself. She said you could call her Sierra, not ma'am or missus. She did not like formalities. You looked at me to see if that was okay, and I nodded. You said you thought you would like her. A small smile crossed Cole's face at the memory. Over the next 2 days while we prepared, Sierra spent time teaching you things. How to read animal tracks. How to move quietly through brush. Basic Apache words. You were fascinated by her, and she seemed to relax around you in a way she did not with adults. Maybe because you did not judge her, did not care that she was half Apache or that her father had abandoned her. You just saw someone who knew interesting things and was willing to teach them. Tommy remembered this part. He nodded, his own memory aligning with Cole's narrative. Meanwhile, I went into town to gather information, visited the saloon, talked to shopkeepers, learned that 15 families had indeed lost land to Garrett. Most were afraid to speak openly, but in private conversations, their anger came through. They wanted justice but did not believe it was possible. Garrett seemed untouchable. Cole described meeting Joseph Carter, the 68-year-old veteran who had lost 80 acres to Garrett's schemes. Joseph had fought at Gettysburg, had survived 3 years of war only to lose his family's land to legal theft. When I told him we were building a case against Garrett, he did not believe me at first. But when I explained that Sierra was willing to lead the fight, that we had evidence coming, that the territorial governor would be involved, something shifted in his eyes. The old soldier's response had been immediate and absolute. Joseph said he was old but not dead, that he had fought for principle once and would do it again. He agreed to help gather the other families, to convince them that together they had power. One person could be silenced or threatened. 15 families standing together was harder to dismiss. Cole explained how they spent 2 more days carefully building their alliance. How Magnus, true to his word, used his access to Garrett's bank to identify where the forged documents were kept. The records were in a safe in Garrett's private office. Magnus had been in that office before. He had helped Garrett organize some of the paperwork years ago when he still thought Garrett was legitimate. Now that knowledge became useful. The plan was coming together piece by piece, but they needed one more element. We needed Garrett to feel confident, to think he had already won. So Magnus went to see him, told Garrett that I had agreed to sign over mineral rights to Sierra's land, that the marriage was legitimate and I could be bought for the right price. Garrett was pleased. He set up a meeting for 4 days from then to finalize the paperwork. Tommy interrupted, "But you were not really going to sign." "No," Cole confirmed, "but we needed Garrett to think I would. We needed him to gather all his documentation in one place, and to have his lawyers ready, to bring together everything that would prove his crimes. Then, when the territorial governor's representative arrived, we would have Garrett trapped with all the evidence right there." It was a good plan, a solid plan, but plans rarely survived contact with reality unchanged. On the night before we were supposed to meet Garrett, Billy came to the ranch. You remember Billy, the young gunfighter who had warned me about Sierra in the desert. He came running like the devil was chasing him, and in a way, he was. Cole's voice grew tense with the memory. Billy said Garrett knew something was wrong, did not know the details, but his instincts were screaming danger. Garrett had sent word to El Paso for reinforcements. 10 more gunmen were coming, professional killers who would arrive by morning. Once they got there, Garrett would make his move, would take Sierra by force, kill anyone who resisted, and sort out the legalities later, with forged documents claiming self-defense. The revelation had changed everything. We did not have 4 days anymore. We did not even have one full day. We had maybe 12 hours before Garrett's reinforcements arrived, and our slim advantage disappeared completely. Cole stood and paced, the nervous energy of that moment translating across 3 years into the present telling. I called everyone together. Sierra, Magnus, Dakota's 2 warriors, Joseph Carter, and the heads of the 15 families we had recruited. I laid out the situation. We had to act tonight, had to get the evidence tonight, had to be ready for a fight by morning because that fight was coming whether we wanted it or not. Tommy leaned forward, caught in the tension of the story. Joseph asked how many guns we had. I counted. 12 men from the families willing to fight. The 2 Apache warriors, Magnus, me. 16 total. Garrett had at least 20 men already, with 10 more coming. We were outnumbered even before the reinforcements arrived. The mathematics of violence were simple and brutal. Sierra said numbers did not matter, that we had truth on our side. I told her truth did not stop bullets. She met my eyes and said then we would have to be faster, smarter, and more committed than men who were only fighting for money. Cole remembered the steel in her voice, the absolute conviction that they would win because they had to win. We divided responsibilities. Magnus would break into Garrett's office that night and steal the forged documents. He would have until midnight. If he was not back by midnight, we would assume he had been caught or had betrayed us. The Apache warriors would watch the roads for Garrett's reinforcements. I would position our defenders around the ranch, and Sierra would coordinate the families, make sure everyone understood their role. The plan was rushed, improvised, and dangerous, but it was all they had. At 10 that night, Magnus rode into town. The 2 Apache warriors shadowed him from a distance, ready to kill him if he went anywhere except the bank. I watched them disappear into the darkness, then turned to organizing our defenses. Cole described the preparations in detail. How they reinforced the ranch house windows with extra boards. How they positioned water barrels in case of fire. How they distributed ammunition and assigned fields of fire so no one would accidentally shoot an ally. Sierra worked alongside me the whole time. She did not give orders so much as make suggestions that everyone wanted to follow. The families respected her. They saw that she was risking everything, that she had the most to lose, and that gave them courage. As midnight approached, tension mounted. Cole stationed himself where he could see the road from town, his Winchester ready. At 5 minutes before midnight, I saw movement, a single rider coming fast. I raised my rifle, then lowered it when I recognized Magnus's horse. He rode straight to the ranch house, dismounted before the horse fully stopped, and ran inside. Magnus was carrying a leather satchel that he dropped on the table with a heavy thud. Inside were dozens of documents, all carefully organized and labeled. Magnus had not just stolen the forged court orders. He had taken Garrett's entire record-keeping system. Lists of bribes paid, names of judges who took money, detailed accounts of every illegal land seizure for the past 7 years. It was not just evidence. It was a complete indictment. Sierra had looked at her father with something that might have been the beginning of respect, though she did not say anything. Magnus noticed her look and seemed to stand a little straighter. I asked Magnus if Garrett knew the documents were missing. He shook his head. The bank safe was still locked. Bank safe was... Magnus had picked the lock, removed the documents, then locked it again. Garrett would not know anything was wrong until he opened the safe, which he probably would not do until the scheduled meeting. That bought them time, but not much. Cole immediately sent a rider to intercept the territorial governor's representative, who was already en route. The rider carried a letter explaining everything and asking the representative to come immediately with federal marshals if possible. Then we waited. Waiting before a fight is always the hardest part. Your mind invents 1,000 disasters. Your body wants to move, to act, to do something. But discipline means staying in position, staying ready, conserving energy for when it matters. Cole had walked the perimeter throughout the night, checking on defenders, making small adjustments, offering quiet words of encouragement. Around 2 in the morning, I found Sierra on the roof of the house where she had set up a sniper position. She was lying flat with a rifle watching the road. I climbed up and sat next to her. For maybe 90 seconds, neither of us spoke, just watched the stars and listened to the desert night. The memory of that silence carried a particular weight. Sierra said she was afraid, not of dying but of failing, of letting down all the families who were depending on her, of proving her father right that she was not capable of managing her inheritance. I told her that fear was reasonable, that anyone who was not afraid before a fight was either stupid or lying. Cole had shared his own fear then, a rare moment of vulnerability. I told her I was afraid of failing Tommy, that I had promised his father I would keep him safe, and here I was bringing him into a war zone. Sierra said Tommy was safer here with us than he would be anywhere else if Garrett won, that sometimes the most dangerous thing was not fighting. It was running and hoping the evil would not follow. They had sat in silence for another 30 seconds. Then Sierra asked the question that had been hanging between them since the Apache camp. She asked if our marriage was real or just paperwork. I did not answer right away. It was a complicated question that deserved a complicated answer. Finally, I said that it started as paperwork, but was becoming something else. Something neither of us planned, but both of us recognized. Tommy watched Cole's face carefully, seeing emotions that the man rarely displayed. Sierra said she felt the same way, that she had not wanted to need anyone, but she was starting to think that needing people was not weakness. It was just being human. We sat together until dawn started to lighten the eastern sky, not touching, but not separate either. Just two people facing impossible odds and finding comfort in shared presence. As the sun rose, their lookouts spotted dust on the horizon. Riders coming from the south. Garrett's reinforcements from El Paso. I counted 10 men riding hard. They would reach town within the hour. That meant we had maybe 2 hours before Garrett organized his forces and came for us. I gathered everyone and laid out what I expected. Cole's voice took on the tone of command. I told them that when the fight started, some of us might die. That was the reality of violence. But dying for something that mattered was different than dying for nothing. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their futures. Garrett's men were fighting for money. That difference meant something. Joseph Carter had stood and spoken then, his old voice cracking but strong. He said that he had fought in the bloodiest war this country ever saw, had watched boys die for principle and honor and freedom. This fight was small compared to that, but it was no less important. He said he would rather die defending what was right than live one more day under Garrett's shadow. Every man there agreed. The alliance was solid. Their resolve was unshakable, but that did not change the mathematics of violence. They were still outnumbered. At 8 that morning, a rider came from town, not one of Garrett's men, but the territorial governor's representative. He had received our message and ridden through the night with 4 federal marshals. The odds had just shifted. Tommy's face lit up with relief. Cole shook his head. Do not think that made it easy. 6 more men helped, but Garrett still had 30 guns. And more importantly, Garrett was not going to surrender peacefully. He knew the documents proved his crimes, knew that capture meant hanging. Men with nothing to lose are the most dangerous kind. The standoff lasted until noon when Garrett and his entire force rode up to the ranch. Cole described how they came not in a rush, but in a slow, deliberate formation. 30 armed men arrayed like a military unit. Garrett rode at the front. He was 45 years old, well-dressed, groomed like a gentleman. If you saw him on the street, you would think he was a successful businessman, which he was, technically. His business just happened to be theft and murder disguised as banking. Garrett called out from 50 yards, his voice carrying across the distance. He said he knew we had taken something that belonged to him. He wanted it back. If we returned his property and Sierra signed over her land, he would let everyone live. If we refused, he would burn the ranch to the ground with everyone inside. Sierra had stood up where Garrett could see her. Her voice rang out clear and strong. She told Garrett that his documents were with the territorial governor's representative, that charges were being filed, that he could surrender now and face trial, or resist and face death. His choice, wow. Garrett laughed. It was not a happy sound. He said the documents did not matter, that judges could be bribed, that witnesses could disappear, that he had been untouchable for years and would remain so. Then he gave a signal and his men raised their weapons. The battle was about to begin. Cole ended this part of the story there, letting the tension build for the next night's telling. That is where we stop for tonight. Tomorrow I will tell you about the fight, about how Sierra proved she was the best shot any of us had ever seen, about how Magnus made his final choice between redemption and cowardice, about blood and bullets and the price we paid for justice. Tommy looked like he wanted to protest, wanted to hear the rest immediately, but he also understood that some stories needed to be parceled out carefully, digested in pieces. Sleep now, Cole said. We still have one more day of riding before we reach the ranch, before you see where all of this happened, before you understand why Magnus Holloway's grave sits on a hill overlooking land that his daughter owns free and clear. The fire burned low. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the darkness, the desert held its secrets close, waiting for dawn to reveal them piece by piece. The third and final night found them camped within sight of the ranch, close enough that Tommy could see the lights burning in the windows. Sierra was there, waiting with their daughter. Home was less than an hour away, but Cole insisted on making camp one last time. Some stories needed to be finished before you could cross certain thresholds. The fire burned bright against the cool October darkness. Tommy sat cross-legged, his full attention on Cole, who stared into the flames as if reading the past written there in ash and in embers. The moment before violence starts, Cole began, there is always a pause, a held breath where the world seems to stop spinning. Everyone knows what is coming. Everyone has chosen their path. But for one perfect instant, everything balances on a knife edge between peace and war. He looked up at Tommy, his eyes reflecting firelight. That morning, with 30 of Garrett's guns pointed at us, that moment stretched longer than it should have. Maybe 5 full seconds where no one moved. No one breathed. Then Garrett raised his hand to signal the attack. Cole paused, letting the memory sharpen. But before his hand could drop, something unexpected happened. A voice called out from behind Garrett's line. A young voice. Billy, the 19-year-old gunfighter who had warned us, rode forward. He was shaking so hard I could see it from 50 yards away, but he rode forward anyway. The image was vivid, painted in Cole's measured words. Billy positioned himself between Garrett and us. He turned in his saddle to face Garrett and said he was not going to be part of murder, that he had signed on as a ranch hand, not an assassin, that his mother raised him better than this. His voice cracked when he said it, but he said it. Tommy leaned forward, caught in the moment. Garrett told Billy to move or die with us. Billy did not move, just sat there on his horse, shaking like a leaf in a storm but holding position. That was when 2 more of Garrett's men rode forward to join Billy, then another. Within 30 seconds, 6 men had defected. The odds were shifting, but they were still dangerous. Garrett's face went red with fury. He pulled his pistol and shot Billy through the chest, did not hesitate, did not warn him again. just killed him for defying orders. Billy fell from his horse and hit the ground hard. The other 5 men who had defected scattered, riding fast for safety. Cole's voice hardened at the memory of casual murder. That was when the shooting started. Not with strategy or planning, but with chaos. Garrett's remaining men opened fire. We returned fire. The territorial representative and his marshals added their guns to ours. For maybe 90 seconds, it was just noise and smoke and confusion. He described the initial exchange in clinical detail. How the defenders had the advantage of cover, how Garrett's men were exposed in the open, how the professional killers from El Paso were better shots than the local hired hands and made the difference. In those first 90 seconds, we lost one man. John Patterson, a farmer who had lost his land 3 years before. He took a bullet through the throat and died before anyone could help him. On Garrett's side, 4 men went down. 1 dead, 3 wounded. The mathematics of violence played out in real time. Garrett's men broke formation and scattered, looking for cover. They took positions behind rocks, in ditches, anywhere that offered protection. The fight stopped being a single battle and became a dozen small skirmishes happening simultaneously. Cole stood and paced, unable to sit still through this part of the story. I was positioned on the east side of the house with Tommy and 3 other men. Our job was to hold that approach and prevent Garrett from flanking us. Sierra was on the roof with her rifle, acting as a sniper. She had the best vantage point and the steadiest hand of anyone there. He looked at Tommy directly. You were terrified, I could see it, but you loaded rifles for me and the others without hesitation. Kept ammunition moving, stayed low when bullets came close. You did exactly what needed doing despite your fear. That is the definition of courage. Tommy's face showed he remembered, though his memories were fragmented by the chaos and terror of that morning. Sierra started picking off Garrett's men one by one. She did not shoot to kill unless necessary. She aimed for shoulders, legs, anywhere that would take a man out of the fight without ending his life. But she never missed. 3 shots, 3 men down. The survivors started to realize they were being hunted by someone with exceptional skill. Cole described how Sierra's accuracy created psychological pressure on Garrett's forces, how men became afraid to expose themselves, how the weight of that fear started to crack their discipline. Around 15 minutes into the fight, Magnus did something I did not expect. He left his defensive position inside the house and ran toward where Billy's body lay in the open ground between both forces. I thought he had lost his mind. Bullets were kicking up dirt all around him. But he made it to Billy's body, lying where it had fallen. The moment was significant for reasons beyond tactics. Magnus stood up in full view of both sides. He was completely exposed, an easy target, but he looked directly at Garrett and shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. He said that Billy had been 19 years old, that his mother lived in Albuquerque, and someone would have to tell her that her son died trying to do the right thing. That every man fighting for Garrett needed to think about whether money was worth dying for. The impromptu speech had an effect. 2 more of Garrett's men threw down their weapons and rode away. They were not willing to die for a man who killed his own employees for having a conscience. Garrett screamed at them, but they did not stop. That left him with roughly 22 men against our 21. Nearly even odds now. But even odds still meant bloodshed. Cole continued the narrative, describing how the fight settled into a grinding exchange, how both sides tried to gain advantage through position and patience rather than reckless charges. The territorial representative tried to negotiate. He called out to Garrett that surrender was still possible, that the territorial governor was prepared to offer leniency to anyone except Garrett himself, that the hired guns could walk away if they put down their weapons immediately. Garrett's response had been predictable. He shouted back that they would have to kill him, that he would not hang, that if he was going down, he would take as many of us with him as possible. It was not bravado, it was simple fact. Samuel Garrett had decided he would rather die fighting than face justice. The stalemate continued through the morning. Cole described the oppressive heat as the sun climbed higher, the way sweat made weapons slippery, the way fear and adrenaline exhausted men faster than physical exertion. Around 11 that morning, Garrett changed tactics. He set fire to the barn. The wind was blowing toward the house, and he was trying to smoke us out or force us to abandon our positions to save the horses and livestock. The fire spread quickly through dry hay and old wood. Cole and 5 others had to break cover to rescue the animals. That was when Garrett made his move. While we were distracted, he sent 10 men in a rush toward the house. They came fast and hard, firing as they ran. It was a suicide charge, but it almost worked. The chaos of that moment came through in Cole's voice, the remembered fear and desperation. The defenders at the house were outnumbered suddenly. 3 on 3 became 3 on 10 in seconds. Garrett's men reached the porch. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out. I saw Joseph Carter, the old veteran, grappling with a man 40 years younger. Joseph was losing until one of the Apache warriors put an arrow through the younger man's leg. Sierra had responded from the roof, her rifle cracking steadily. 4 shots, 3 hits. But she could not target everyone in the melee below without risk of hitting allies. That was when Magnus emerged from inside the house. He was carrying a double-barrel shotgun. He stepped onto the porch and fired both barrels into the cluster of attackers at point-blank range. 2 men went down immediately. The blast was so loud it momentarily stopped the fighting everywhere. Magnus had reloaded with practiced speed and fired again. Another attacker fell. The remaining attackers on the porch broke and ran. They had not expected such fierce resistance, had not expected an old man to fight like a cornered animal. Magnus had bought the defenders crucial seconds to regroup and reorganize. But the cost was mounting. Cole's voice grew heavier. Joseph Carter had been stabbed during the melee. The wound was not immediately fatal, but it was serious. We got him inside where Sierra could try to treat it with what medical supplies we had. He was in pain, but conscious, still giving orders about how to strengthen the defenses. The fight continued into afternoon. Both sides were exhausted, running low on ammunition, operating on fear and determination alone. Around 2 that afternoon, Dakota arrived with 15 Apache warriors. I had sent word to him that morning through one of his scouts, asking for help. The warriors came fast, using desert trails that cut travel time in half. The arrival of reinforcements changed everything. Dakota's warriors attacked Garrett's men from behind, from the side, from directions they had not anticipated. The Apache did not use guns primarily. They used bows, which were silent. Garrett's men started falling to arrows without warning, without knowing where the attack was coming from. Psychological warfare combined with tactical advantage. Within 20 minutes of Dakota's arrival, Garrett's force had been reduced to 12 men. They were surrounded, outgunned, and demoralized. The territorial representative called for surrender again. This time, 8 of the remaining men accepted. They threw down their weapons and raised their hands. That left Garrett with 4 loyalists, men who knew they were too implicated in his crimes to expect mercy. Garrett and his final 4 men made a break for it. They tried to fight their way through the Apache warriors to reach their horses. 3 of them died in the attempt. Garrett and 1 other man made it to their mounts and rode hard for town. Cole had pursued them immediately. I grabbed a fresh horse and went after them. Sierra shouted at me to let them go, that it was over, but I could not. Garrett knew too much, had too many connections. If he escaped, he could rebuild his operation somewhere else. This had to end today. The chase lasted 5 miles across open desert. Cole described the pounding rhythm of hooves, the way heat shimmered off the sand, the gradual realization that his horse was faster, that he was gaining. Garrett's companion went down first. His horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and went tumbling. The rider broke his neck in the fall. That left just Garrett and me. He knew I was closing. He turned in his saddle and fired 3 wild shots that came nowhere close. Cole had not returned fire, had conserved his ammunition for when he needed it. 2 miles from town, Garrett's horse stumbled. It did not fall, but it slowed enough that I closed the final distance. I rode alongside him and launched myself from my saddle to his. We both went down hard, rolling in the dirt and rocks. The fight that followed was brutal and personal. Garrett was bigger than me, but older and softer. We traded punches. He fought like a man who had everything to lose. I fought like a man who had people depending on him. There is a difference. Desperation makes you wild. Responsibility makes you focused. After maybe 90 seconds of grappling, Cole had gotten Garrett in a chokehold and held it until the older man went limp. I tied him with his own belt and rope from his saddle, put him face down across his horse, and led both animals back to the ranch. It took over an hour. The whole time Garrett was conscious, cursing, threatening, promising revenge. I did not respond. There was nothing to say to a man like that. When Cole returned to the ranch, the aftermath of battle was evident everywhere. Bodies being gathered, wounded being treated, defenders sitting exhausted in whatever shade they could find. The territorial representative took custody of Garrett immediately. Federal marshals shackled him and prepared to transport him to Santa Fe for trial. Garrett stopped cursing long enough to look at me. He said I had no idea what I had done, that he had friends in high places who would make my life hell, that I would regret crossing him. Cole's response had been simple. I told him the only thing I regretted was not killing him when I had the chance. Then I turned my back and walked away. I never saw him again. He was tried, convicted of multiple murders and land fraud, and hanged 6 weeks later. The immediate victory was won, but the costs were still being counted. We lost 3 men total: John Patterson at the beginning, a ranch hand named Miguel during the assault on the house, and Joseph Carter, who died from his stab wound despite Sierra's best efforts to save him. Cole's voice softened with genuine grief. Joseph held on until after Garrett was captured. When we told him it was over, that we had won, he smiled, said he could die satisfied knowing he had done one last meaningful thing with his life. He asked us to make sure his land went to his granddaughter in Colorado. Then he closed his eyes and did not open them again. Tommy was crying quietly. Cole led him, understanding that some stories demanded emotional response. On Garrett's side, 18 men died. Another 9 were seriously wounded. The survivors were arrested and charged according to their level of involvement. Some went to prison, others were released after testifying against Garrett. The legal aftermath took months to sort through, but the immediate crisis was over. That evening, after the bodies were buried and the wounded were stabilized, Magnus asked to speak with Sierra. She refused at first, did not want to hear excuses or apologies, but Dakota convinced her. He said that Magnus had earned the right to speak by fighting when he could have run. The conversation happened on the porch of the ranch house at sunset. Cole had been present at Magnus's request, serving as witness to whatever was said. Magnus told Sierra he did not expect forgiveness, that he had no right to ask for it, but he wanted her to know that fighting beside her that day was the first time in 12 years he had felt like a man instead of a coward. Sierra had listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. Magnus said that when Ayanna died, something inside him broke, that he became afraid of everything, especially of losing Sierra too. So he sent her away where enemies could not reach her, but also where he did not have to face his own failure every day. He knew it was selfish, knew it was cruel, but fear made him weak and weakness made him evil. The confession was complete and devastating in its honesty. He told Sierra he understood if she never wanted to see him again, that he would accept whatever boundaries she set, but he asked for one thing. He asked if she would let him prove through actions that he could be better, not with words or promises, but with steady, consistent behavior over years if necessary. Sierra had been silent for a long time. Cole remembered counting the seconds, watching emotions play across her face like storm clouds. Finally, she spoke. She said Magnus could not reclaim the past, could not undo 12 years of abandonment, but he could choose who to be going forward. She would not forgive him yet, but she would not shut the door completely. He would have to earn his way back into her life one day at a time. Magnus had wept then, not loud crying, but silent tears that ran down his weathered face and dripped onto the porch boards. Sierra watched him cry and did not comfort him. That was part of his penance, living with the consequences of his choices without expectation of absolution. But she did not walk away either. She stayed and let him feel his grief in her presence. That was its own kind of mercy. The days that followed brought more healing than Cole had expected possible. Sierra officially took control of her land. The territorial governor personally delivered the legal documents confirming her ownership. 5,000 acres, mineral rights included, worth somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million depending on the quality of the silver vein. But Sierra's plans for the land surprised everyone. She announced she was creating a cooperative community, 15% of the land would be divided among the families Garrett had wronged. They would own it outright, not as tenants but as partners. Another 15% would be given to Dakota's Apache Band, legally recognized as permanent residents with full rights. The remaining 70% would be managed collectively. Sierra wanted to build something new, a place where Apache and American settlers could live together, share resources, teach each other. She wanted to prove that her mother's dream of bridging two worlds could work if people were willing to try. Tommy interrupted. Did it work? Yes, Cole said simply. It took years. There were difficulties and misunderstandings and moments when it seemed like it might fall apart. But yes, it worked. The community that exists there now is proof. He continued with Magnus's story, the part that weighed heaviest. Magnus threw himself into the work of building the community. He used his experience managing ranches to organize construction and irrigation. He taught younger men about cattle and horses. He never asked for recognition or special treatment from Sierra, just worked alongside everyone else. Over 6 months, father and daughter began to rebuild something that resembled a relationship. It was not instant reconciliation. Sierra did not call him father for almost a year, but they worked together, ate meals at the same table, had conversations about practical matters that gradually expanded to include personal topics. Trust grew slowly, like plants in desert soil. Then came the attack that changed everything. 8 months after Garrett's execution, 3 men rode into the community at night. They were associates of Garrett's from El Paso, men who blamed us for his death. They came for revenge. The attack was swift and brutal. They set fire to the barn again, trying to recreate Garrett's tactic. When people ran out to fight the fire, the 3 men opened fire from concealment. 2 people were hit in the first volley. One of them was Sierra. Cole's voice went flat with remembered fear. She took a bullet through the shoulder. Not fatal, but serious. She went down hard. The shooters repositioned to finish her off while she was vulnerable. That was when Magnus moved. The old man had been near the main house when the shooting started. He ran towards Sierra without hesitation. No weapon drawn, no thought for his own safety. Just ran straight into gunfire to put himself between the shooters and his daughter. He was hit twice, once in the chest, once in the stomach. Both wounds were severe. The Apache warriors had killed all 3 attackers within seconds of Magnus being shot, but the damage was done. We carried Magnus and Sierra into the house. Sierra's wound was painful but clean. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. She would recover fully. Magnus was different. The chest wound had collapsed one lung. The stomach wound was bleeding internally. There was no doctor within 50 miles. No way to save him with the resources available. Magnus stayed conscious for about 2 hours. He spent most of that time with Sierra. She held his hand and finally called him father. He smiled when she said it, said he did not deserve that word, but was grateful to hear it before he died. Cole paused, his own voice rough with emotion. Magnus used those last hours to say things he should have said years before. He told Sierra that her mother would be proud of her, that Ayana's dream of bridging 2 worlds was coming true through their daughter's work. He said he was sorry for being weak when she needed him to be strong, but he was grateful that she had become strong anyway. Sierra had cried then, but they were complicated tears. Grief mixed with relief, mixed with anger, mixed with love. Magnus asked me to take care of Sierra and Tommy, to be the man he had failed to be. I told him I would, but that Sierra did not need me to take care of her. She was capable of taking care of herself. Magnus smiled at that, said yes, she was. That was perhaps his greatest achievement. Despite his failures, he had raised a woman who did not need anyone but chose her connections anyway. The old man's breathing had become labored. Each word required visible effort. His last words were to Sierra. He said, "I love you. I always loved you. I just did not know how to show it without fear getting in the way. I am sorry. I am so sorry." Then he looked at her face one more time, smiled slightly, and died. The silence that followed in the story matched the silence around the campfire. Tommy was crying openly now. Cole let him, understanding that grief was part of growth. We buried Magnus on the hill overlooking the land Sierra had transformed. Dakota performed a ceremony that blended Apache and Christian traditions. Representatives from all 15 families attended. Everyone spoke about how Magnus had changed in his final months, how he had tried to become better. Sierra had spoken last at the funeral. She said that her father was not a good man for most of his life, but at the end, he remembered how to be brave. He had protected her when it mattered most. She would remember him not as the man who abandoned her, but as the man who came back. Not as the coward, but as the father who finally learned to love without fear. Cole stood and walked to his saddle, pulling out a small leather journal. After Magnus died, we found this in his belongings. It was a journal he had been keeping since Sierra returned from the Apache camp. Every day for 8 months he had written to her, thoughts he was too afraid to say out loud, apologies he did not know how to voice, observations about watching her become a leader. He opened it carefully, the pages worn from multiple readings. On the last page, written the day before he died, Magnus wrote this: "Tomorrow I will tell the Sierra that I am proud of her, that I see Ayana in everything she does, that watching her build something beautiful from my ruins gives me hope that redemption is possible, even for men like me. Tomorrow I will be brave enough to say these things. Tomorrow I will finally be the father she deserved." Cole closed the journal gently. He never got his tomorrow, but we gave the journal to Sierra. She read it cover to cover that night. In the morning, she told me she understood her father better. That understanding was not the same as forgiveness, but it was the beginning. Tommy wiped his eyes. What happened next? Life happened, Cole said simply. Sierra and I discovered that our marriage of convenience had become real somewhere along the way. Not through grand declarations or dramatic moments, but through daily choices to trust each other, to support each other, to build something together. He smiled slightly. One night about a year after Magnus died, Sierra and I were sitting exactly where you and I are sitting now, under the stars, near a fire. She said that her heart, which she had declared free during the wedding ceremony, was no longer free. She had given it to me without realizing when it happened. I told her mine was the same. We decided to renew our vows, this time meaning them. The community had celebrated with a ceremony that brought together every cultural tradition represented in their diverse population. 2 years after that, your sister Ayana was born. We named her after Sierra's mother. Dakota said it was a good name, that the spirit of the original Ayana would watch over her namesake. And you, Tommy. In these 3 years, you have grown from that scared 11-year-old boy into someone this community relies on. You help teach the younger children to read. You learn tracking from Sierra better than most grown men. You treat the Apache families with the same respect you show everyone else. Your father James would be proud of who you are becoming. Cole looked at Tommy seriously. You asked me 3 nights ago if I was ever scared. Now you know the answer. I was terrified for 3 straight months. Terrified of failing you. Terrified of letting Sierra down. Terrified of making wrong choices that would get good people killed. But I learned something important. He let the words sink in. Fear does not make you a coward. Fear is just information. It tells you that something matters enough to be afraid of losing it. The question is what you do with that fear. Do you let it paralyze you like it paralyzed Magnus for 12 years? Or do you feel the fear and act anyway, knowing that some things are worth the risk? Tommy nodded slowly, processing this lesson. Magnus taught me that it is never too late to change. Never too late to choose differently. He wasted 12 years being a coward, but in his final 8 months, he became brave. And that bravery, though late, mattered. It saved Sierra's life. It gave him a chance to die with honor instead of shame. Cole stood and began banking the fire for the night. Tomorrow we will ride into the ranch. You will meet Sierra again, properly this time. You will meet Ayana, who is 2 years old and has your stubbornness. You will see the community that grew from blood and determination and the refusal to accept that evil could win. You will see Magnus's grave and understand why we honor it, despite his failures. He looked out toward where the ranch lights glowed in the darkness. That community exists because people chose to be brave when being afraid would have been easier. Joseph Carter chose to fight despite his age. Billy chose to defy Garrett despite knowing it would cost his life. Magnus chose to shield his daughter despite 12 years of cowardice. And Sierra chose to build bridges instead of walls despite every reason to hate. Cole sat back down next to Tommy. I tell you this story not to entertain you, but to teach you. Life will give you moments where you have to choose between fear and courage, between selfishness and sacrifice, between giving up and persisting. The choices you make in those moments define who you become. The fire crackled softly. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had witnessed countless human dramas. Your father James made me promise to raise you right, to teach you to be a good man. I cannot make you good. That is your choice. But I can show you what goodness looks like. Sometimes it looks like Sierra, building community from conflict. Sometimes it looks like Magnus, finding redemption at the last moment. Sometimes it looks like ordinary people doing extraordinary things because the alternative is unacceptable. Tommy spoke quietly. What does it look like when you do it? Cole smiled slightly. It looks like keeping promises even when they are hard. It looks like staying when running would be easier. It looks like raising a boy who is not mine by blood, but is mine by choice, and doing my best to help him become someone his father would be proud of. He put his hand on Tommy's shoulder. You are becoming that man. You have learned to track and shoot and survive in harsh country. But more importantly, you have learned to be kind to Sarah, patient with Ayana, respectful to Dakota, and helpful to the community. Those qualities matter more than any skill with weapons or horses. Tommy looked at the distant lights of home. Tomorrow, when you see Magnus's grave, I want you to read what is carved on the marker. Sierra chose the words carefully. They say Magnus Holloway. He found courage when it seemed too late, but it is never too late to do what is right. Cole stood and offered Tommy a hand up. That is the lesson of this story. Not that good always wins or that justice always prevails. Sometimes evil wins. Sometimes good people die. But as long as you are breathing, you have the opportunity to choose courage over fear, to choose right over easy, to choose to be better than you were yesterday. They walked together toward their bedrolls, the fire burning low behind them. Sleep now. Tomorrow we go home. Tomorrow you see what was built from the ashes of violence and corruption. Tomorrow you understand why this story matters. Why I spent 3 nights telling it instead of just saying that we fought some bad men and won. Tommy climbed into his blankets but had one more question. Do you think Magnus found peace? At the end? Cole considered this carefully before answering. I think Magnus found something better than peace. He found purpose. In his last moments protecting Sierra, he finally became the father he always should have been. That mattered more than peace. It mattered more than forgiveness. It proved that change was possible, that redemption was real, that a man could be defined by his final choice as much as his lifetime of mistakes. He looked up at the stars one last time. The world measures men by their successes and failures, but I think we should be measured by whether we learn from our mistakes and try to do better. Magnus failed terribly, but he learned. And at the last moment when it counted most, he chose right. That is not nothing. That is everything. Tommy closed his eyes, the story complete in his mind now. Cole sat watching the embers die, thinking about all the choices that had led to this moment. A boy asleep under desert stars. A ranch waiting in the darkness. A wife and daughter representing the future he had never imagined possible. 3 years ago, he had ridden into Red Ridge with nothing but a Winchester and a scared boy. Now he had a family, a community, and a purpose. The journey had cost blood and pain and the lives of good people, but it had also proven that sometimes, despite everything, courage and determination could build something lasting from ruins. The fire died to coals. Cole pulled his blanket tight and closed his eyes. Tomorrow they would complete the journey. Tomorrow Tommy would see the proof that stories were not just words, but blueprints for how to live. Tomorrow, the past and present would connect, showing that legacy was not what you inherited, but what you chose to build. In the darkness, the desert held its ancient silence. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. And somewhere between past and future, between memory and hope, the story found its ending in the simple truth that every day offered the chance to choose courage over fear. And that choice, repeated enough times, could change everything.